Namaste and welcome to Vijay Manthan. For those of you that are new to VM, if you want to find out more about Vijay Manthan, what we do and how you can get involved, you can find all of the key links in the description down below or stick around until the end. Now, before we get started tonight, I just want to mention to our audience that are listening in live, we will be taking your questions for Adam later on in the fireside. So if you have questions, please feel free to share them on the YouTube chat function, and our team will pick them up throughout our conversation tonight. So tonight's fireside is titled, "Is the Price of Safety Liberty?" In the backdrop of the current pandemic, we've relied more and more on the government to try and keep us safe. But at what cost? And is that cost liberty? To help us Manthan or discuss this topic, we are joined by Adam Wagner. Adam is a barrister at Doherty Street Chambers, specializing in human rights, public and civil law. He's a visiting professor at Goldsmiths University of London and founder and chair of Each Other, a human rights news and discussion platform. Hi, Adam. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So just to get us started then, for your opening question, can I ask, what does liberty mean?
What does liberty mean? It's a great question. And I don't think one which has a recognizably straightforward answer. You can ask different people and they'll come up with different answers. I think, look, generally in the theory, there is a distinction made between positive and negative liberty, which I find quite useful, and that comes from Isaiah Berlin.
Okay.
Positive liberty is the freedom to do things, to go about your life, to work, to have social relations, to practice a religion, those sorts of things.
Okay.
And freedom from, so negative liberty, is the freedom to be protected against being done to. So usually by the state doing things to you, like torturing you or detaining you without lawful authority, or preventing you leaving the home, things like that. So that's a kind of, a descriptive distinction that you can make. I think on a more basic level, so what would an ordinary person think of liberty as meaning? I think it means the right to flourish. It's the right to do the things that allow you to be the person that you are and become the person that you want to be, and that is your sort of that is who you desire to be, and that, I think, that is when you get into human rights law, which is my field. In human rights law, there is a very basic concept of dignity, which underlies all of the rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the European Convention on Human Rights. And dignity, I think, is similar to that idea of flourishing. It's you look at who is this person, and what does it take to allow them to flourish, and at the heart of that is dignity. And it's also, interestingly, it's got a religious history to it, that idea of dignity, and dignity coming into the human rights declaration came probably through a Christian idea of dignity. That's for another lecture, but I think it's something around that. But I think in this debate, the important thing is, how free do you think an individual should be from interventions by the state? That's what this debate over liberty and safety is about. Is your conception of liberty that you are free from constraints by the state completely, and that everything is voluntary and sort of ethical? Or is there another version of liberty where your liberty is protected by constraints in certain situations.
Okay, so you brought up constraints there. So I'm just going to pick that up and go from there. So we look at the United Kingdom and we think we have liberty, but nowhere that I could find is it written anywhere, right? So we don't have a written constitution where we say, we have liberty enshrined within a constitution. We have, from my understanding, we have a sort of pseudo constitution with different elements that make up a constitution. Now, when we look at constraints, what is constraining so the government from taking away our liberty, let's say? So if we're saying we have a government and that's it, right? There's nowhere written where we say we are looking after our liberty, right? Nobody has that right.
Well, so there is a kind of hodgepodge of different places you can find our rights in the UK, and you're absolutely right. There is no single constitution. There's no single Bill of Rights. We have a Bill of Rights which is 350 years old, which doesn't do very much anymore, but it still exists.
Right.
In the modern and going back further, we have Magna Carta, which also doesn't do very much anymore, but was the first attempt, well, in the last 1,000 years, I guess, to constrain the power of the king in a way which was a sort of contract with the king.
Yeah.
And that's coming towards the present day, the most obvious place to look for our rights is the Human Rights Act, which is an act of Parliament which came into force in 2000, so 21 years old. And in it are a set of rights which are transposed from the European Convention on Human Rights, which includes the right to liberty and security. For example, Article 5 is the right to liberty and security, which says no one shall be deprived of his liberty, save in particular cases.
Right.
There's a right not to be tortured. There's a right to private and family life. There's a right to freedom of expression. And all of those rights are binding on public authorities. So public authorities in law have to comply with them. And if they don't comply with them, then an individual can, in theory, take them to court and get their rights vindicated. So that's the sort of simple, well, not the simple answer, that's the complicated answer to a simple question in lots of places. And I've not mentioned other statutes like the Equality Act, which is where we get the majority of our protections against discrimination, harassment, victimization on grounds of protected characteristics. There's a Freedom of Information Act, which allows us to put in freedom of information requests to public authorities, and various other statutes which create a kind of constitutional architecture without actually being a constitution.
Okay, so from my understanding then, this architecture that we have, at the top would sit Parliament, the elected body. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly right. And the big difference between a constitutional system and a parliamentary system or parliamentary sovereignty system like ours is, if you think of the hierarchy in a constitutional system like in the United States or Germany or practically every liberal democracy, the constitution is at the top of the hierarchy, and below that will be a constitutional court which interprets the constitution, and therefore is the ultimate authority on what the constitution means. And then below that is the legislature and the executive. And the reason the hierarchy matters is because if the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court rules that the executive or the legislature has acted in a way which is unconstitutional, then that action, usually a law, will be struck off or struck out. Whereas in a parliamentary democracy, sovereignty of parliament system like the UK, Parliament sits at the top of the tree, and underneath Parliament is the courts, and in theory the executive, and where that becomes, a fundamental difference as opposed to a kind of aesthetic difference, is that if Parliament passes a law, it can't be struck down by the courts.
Okay.
So a primary piece of legislation cannot be struck down by a court in this country, no matter how bad it is.
Okay, so then in theory, we could have a law that gets passed that goes against the European Human Rights Convention?
Yep.
Okay, and that would be completely lawful, and so the judiciary or no other body could come in and say, okay, you've been, naughty, you can't, you can't do this.
Well, what the courts can do is declare that the law is in breach of human rights laws.
Okay.
And in certain circumstances, the courts can interpret the law in quite a sort of activist way. We're using powers under the Human Rights Act, so they can actually change the words of the law, but that's pretty rare.
Okay.
But ultimately, if Parliament wants to do something, it generally does it. I mean, the only complicating factor there is that we are party to a treaty called the European Convention on Human Rights.
Okay.
And if the state does something which breaches human rights law, and the European Court of Human Rights says we need to rectify it, then we have a responsibility, an obligation in international law to do that. So we'll be breaking international law and domestic law and the Human Rights Act. But in the end, it still comes back to what Parliament wants to do.
Okay. So if Parliament says, okay, this is the law, it's an obligation, but we cannot oblige. That in theory we could do that.
But another way of thinking about it is that Parliament is the king, or the queen, as the king or the queen used to be.
Okay.
Before we became a constitutional monarchy, it's the king or the queen had all the powers that Parliament now has.
Okay.
So
right.
Parliament is sovereign. That's what the sovereignty of Parliament means.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so I just want to move on a little bit. So I want to look at government and the role of government in protecting liberty. So why is it so important first question is, why is it so important to safeguard our liberties? So we've understood generally what liberty is, but why is it so important that we safeguard these?
Well, I mean, if you look at the origins of the European Convention on Human Rights, I think you get the answer, and the Universal Declaration. And they came out of two catastrophic world wars, First World War and the Second World War, when tens of millions of people died from the war. And in the Second World War, millions of people were murdered in the genocide of the Jews, of Roma, of homosexuals, of Black people in and around Central Europe, right in the heart of supposedly Western civilization.
Yeah.
And during the Second World War, the Americans and the Brits in particular started to think, well, what do we want society to look like after? And not just, we want to be the victors and go back home, but we want to create some sort of values-based international system, which is going to be a better version of the international system than this sort of balance of power, dog eat dog world that we've created. And at the same time, you've got the sort of winding down of colonialism as a concept or as a practice over that period. And you've got lots of states coming into being, new states or states that were previously under colonial rule. And there's a lot of sort of creative thinking about, well, what do we want? What do we want political systems to look like? And so they got together and they looked around and looked at the way constitutions of states worked, thought, well, that's not a bad idea to have a sort of constitution for the world.
Right.
You have a set of internationally agreed values expressed as rights that are the kind of basic currency of a liberal society, so that they are the basic criteria that you need for people in societies to be free and equal. Bearing in mind that the world up to then, and now still had never been free or equal.
Okay.
So it's a sort of it's a progressive and hopeful way of looking at the world, and that's what the Universal Declaration and the European Convention on Human Rights were. A set of pretty simple rights, which it's kind of like a code. Like if you put a code into a computer, you say, if you set up a society that doesn't discriminate, that doesn't torture, that doesn't detain people without trial, that doesn't that allows people to have their family and private lives, that allows people to practice whatever religion they want, as long as it doesn't interfere with other people's lives and rights, then that was a decent enough recipe for a good liberal society, and that's where they came from. And in answer to your question, why, apart from this sort of world building approach, the reason why is because it was assumed at the time, I think correctly, that if the world didn't change, there would be a third world war, and that would be the last war. And if you read the beginning of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is a response to aggressive war. That's what it's described as.
Okay.
That's what the hope and the dream of those rights instruments were.
Okay. So we've looked at liberty quite a bit in this opening section. So I want to move on and look at safety, and we're going to stay on the sort of government route. So, in your opinion, then, what is the role of government in keeping its constituency safe?
I think one of the primary roles of government is to keep the population safe within the reasonable boundaries of its powers.
Okay. When you say reasonable boundary, that changes depending on who you're talking to, right? So for me, my boundary might be different from your boundary. So a government telling me, for instance, I should wear a mask in every indoor area. I'm not saying this is the case, but for argument's sake, that could be my boundary, right? Where we can't do that. Or some people might say, you can't tell me where to go and where not to go. So where should we re-land it?
Yeah, so I mean that's the million COVID cases question.
Right.
I think that's a really difficult question, but it goes to the heart of what legitimate government is. And I think legitimate government is something like this. A legitimate government uses it's given powers in exchange for democratic legitimacy. So we elect our governments. That's our sort of and the deal we make is that they sweat the big stuff, so we can get on with the important stuff in our lives. And the classic examples of the things that the government is given the authority to do is things that no individual or no organization would do unless there was a government doing it.
Okay.
And I talk about government. Let's just talk more generally about the state.
Yeah.
Like the classic example of what a state does is provide security to protect its citizens usually through a police force and an army.
Yeah.
Now, it used to be that armies and police forces and fire, services and healthcare were provided by lots and lots of local arrangements.
Yeah.
And that might be run by a local mayor, and there'll be some sort of, fealty arrangement where you pay for individuals' pay, and in exchange they get, or they vote, and in exchange they get protection.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you can trace that back to the king, the various kings, local kings of England, or whichever society you go into. There's always been local sort of approaches to security and safety and that sort of thing, because it's inefficient and actually impossible to do it on your own. So you have to band together, and states are just big versions of those smaller village or town type structures that used to be the world was made up of.
Okay, but sorry. So then, does it not fall apart when you go to a national level? So you said there that we used to be looking after each other, or in small communes would look after that small commune. But when you scale that up to a sort of nation, and you have one state that's applying a law blanketly, does that not then fall apart?
Well, it depends on the law, and it depends on the issue.
Okay.
So public health is another, I think, really good example of a positive role the state can play in a way that individuals and local groups can't. So you can make a public health intervention which can hugely improve people's lives. Now, one example might be healthcare, which is free at the point of use. That really socialized healthcare is not something that can be provided, locally, because you need hospitals, you need to share knowledge. I mean, you might have 3 or 4 insurance companies providing it, like they have in certain countries, but generally, the bigger, the better for that sort of thing. Then you have public health interventions. So when I was growing up, like the big debate was whether they should put fluoride in the water, which some people said is absolutely disastrous and it's going to cause a huge, I don't know, I don't even know what the arguments were against it. But on the other hand, a whole generation of people growing up in this country don't have fillings because there's fluoride in the water.
Yeah.
But it was an intervention. Another big debate when I was growing up was seatbelts. Should seatbelts be compulsory? That is a public safety intervention. It's a law which, it has a lot of parallels with some of the debates we've been having over masks. A lot of people were absolutely horrified with the idea the state could force you to wear a seatbelt. Or in fact, more extreme, another better example is the ban on drinking and driving. Even in the 1970s and 1980s, there was still a culture of drinking and driving. That was seen as, correctly, a danger to the public. It was a danger in a way which I think one of the reasons that it becomes into the state responsibility is because it's not just a danger to you, it's a danger to everyone. If you're driving around drunk, so anyone could be your victim. And so the state gets involved, and it's smoking, it's only recently smoking has been banned indoors. It's absolutely, unbelievable it was ever allowed indoors, but it was, and now it's not. But all of these interventions, seatbelts, smoking indoors, drinking and driving, the same reaction, because people don't like the idea there being something, a right is being taken away, even if it's a right to do something stupid like smoke or drive without a seatbelt or drive while you're drunk. And that, and that comes back to masks.
Okay.
If face covering, a pandemic is another good example of where the state has to get involved, because the very thing that people do on a sort of everyday level in society, which is socializing, is the very thing which causes a new infectious virus to spread. And you're going to have to take some really tough calls on what you do about it. But there are only 2 ways of stopping a virus. the one is creating a sort of, making people socially distance, and the other is vaccinating people, and I suppose the third is infecting everybody.
Right.
What are you going to do? What you're the government? What's your answer?
Right.
What is anybody's answer?
Yeah, I guess that's the million cases question.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah. So okay. So I can't argue with you that sometimes the state has to get involved when it won't work at a small community level. Now I want to put this into context of our current context. So if we look at COVID, and I want to look at the government's response and how it's responded. So when was it 2020, right? When the first lockdown happened, from my understanding, the government used emergency powers to say, okay, we need to enact some laws to be able to impose these sort of lockdowns. And that was done fairly quickly to make sure the lockdowns happened in time. Now, within that short time frame, from what I remember, I don't remember there being a parliamentary debate of, are we going too far? Are we, are the provisions that are being put in correct? So my question is, what are the checks and balances here that stop a government saying we are at a state of emergency and we can impose, these laws without the scrutiny of Parliament?
Yeah, it's a great question. There was a parliamentary debate before lockdown.
Okay.
It happened in 2008.
Right. Okay.
So in 2008, the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984 was amended. And the story of its amendment is really important to the story of the lockdown.
Okay.
Because it was amended after the first SARS outbreak. So COVID is SARS-2.
SARS-2. Yeah.
So SARS-1 was a really serious virus which never spread like COVID has, because it was more serious if you got it, but it only spread once you were visibly infectious. It didn't have asymptomatic spread, which was the sort of killer feature of COVID. But it gave the world a big scare, especially the East, which is why you see Japanese tourists have been wearing masks on the tube for the past 20 years. It's because of SARS-1, because they had a bad experience of that. And after SARS, the World Health Organization, and in fact all of the states that make up the World Health Organization, went to created something called the International Health Regulations. Okay. And they said every state needs to change its law to allow for severe measures. Didn't mention lockdowns, but the implication was there, and there had been a couple of sort of citywide lockdowns during SARS. Yeah. They need to put in place a modern framework of emergency laws if there was another pandemic of this kind.
Okay.
And so in 2008, our main piece of public health legislation, which gives powers, was extensively amended to allow for the executive, so the government, not Parliament, to create regulations which would basically give unlimited power to the executive. Okay. And if it was, as long as what they were doing was for the purpose of protecting protecting against a particular infectious disease, okay. It gave pretty much unlimited powers. And it also, crucially for your question, allowed for regulations to be passed without prior parliamentary approval. So okay. they could be passed with another 28 days to get them into Parliament. Okay. And once they got into Parliament, they couldn't be amended. So the only option would be yes or no.
Okay.
And the government could keep passing regulations on using that power, okay, as often as it wanted.
Okay.
And if you read the debate in 2008, there's a few, and I have because I'm sad like that. I've read the debates. And there's an interesting passage in the Lords where Lord Howe, I think it is, says, but doesn't this give sort of unlimited power to the Secretary of State to, at the stroke of his pen, do whatever he wants? And the Labour government at the time, the minister said, well, I mean, sort of, but we'd never use it for, for the extreme purposes that you're thinking of.
Yeah.
This would be for, to quarantine individuals and that sort of thing, classic plague laws.
Mm-hmm.
Although actually, I don't think anybody had looked back on classic plague laws, because classic plague laws look a lot like the lockdowns.
Okay.
So that's where the debate happened. It happened in the abstract.
Okay.
So by the 26th of March, 2020, when the first set of lockdown regulations came in,
mm-hmm.
The sort of constitutional damage was done.
Okay. So then that raises two questions for me then. So the first one is, you mentioned there that the government has to present it to Parliament within 28 days where there is a vote. No amendments, just votes of yes and no. Now, what happens if Parliament says no? Does it get struck down?
Yep, it gets struck down and it's never happened.
Okay.
So there've been over 100 COVID laws in under 2 years.
Right.
COVID regulations. That's why every single change to the lockdown and, self-isolation, hotel quarantine, travel rules, they've all come in through statutory instruments using this emergency procedure.
Okay.
And nothing has ever been struck down. And in fact, by my count, only about 5 of those 100 odd were debated in Parliament before they came into force. Okay.
So even if something is struck down, for instance, let's use lockdown as an example. When the government imposed the lockdown, after 28 days, the Parliament voted, right? If they had then struck down that law, would that mean all of the things that the law provided, that lockdown law provided, would then be repealed, and the government we would all be sort of out of lockdown immediately? Or would those laws stay in force until some other time where the Parliament said yes, for instance?
It would disappear.
Okay.
From the moment it says no.
Okay, interesting. Okay, and then the second question I had there was around, as long as it's protecting the constituents, right? As long as there is a threat of infection or a threat of a virus. Now, if the threat of the virus at the moment is debated quite heavily, right? Online, we see people saying, "Oh, COVID is no big deal," and then we have the other side that's saying, lock down everything, and we have two sides of this extreme. Now, if the government chooses to, they could say that, in theory, that COVID is always going to be a risk, right? So is there any sort of provision to say, okay, the government has this power, but only for, say, 2 years, and then after 2 years, they will have to reconsider or reapply or something like that?
Oh,
no.
It's not time limited in any way.
Okay.
The only restraint on that power would be, there's two restraints. Either the courts, I told you, the courts can't strike down primary legislation, but they can strike down regulations, so secondary legislation, because all of these laws are made under an act of Parliament, but the laws themselves are regulations. So they're a bit like, how to express it? If you've got I can't think of a good example, but it's basically, think of like the hierarchy again. The primary legislation sits at the top, and then it kind of reigns regulations.
Okay, so because it's not technically passed by Parliament, it's because it was provided by the executive. It doesn't. The judiciary can't overrule it. Is that?
No. So any regulation can be struck down by the court if it's not within the power set by the original primary legislation. So if it's outside of those powers, the court will just declare that, well, you didn't have the power to make it, So, you know, if there's an act of parliament that says you can make regulations to protect people against dangerous dogs,
yeah,
and the government make some regulations about dangerous cats, and they say it's under that legislation, and the court will say, well, that Parliament never gave you the authority to do that, so we're going to tell you that regulation is struck down. So the courts could say, which they've never done, never been asked to do, in fact, that it's not actually an emergency anymore. It's just, you know, like you say, like a virus we're going to live with.
Yeah. Okay. So we've looked at it in the context of COVID and, you know, a pandemic. Now, if we shift over and look at just day-to-day life, right? Let's pretend COVID isn't a thing. We haven't had lockdowns. We're just going about our daily lives here. So in our daily lives, in governance, what checks and balances are there for a government not to impede on our liberties outside of, say, public health?
Well, I mean, the courts
right.
is the main one, and Parliament. You know, Parliament should be one of the things that Parliament has not done during this pandemic is hold the executive to account.
Right.
I think the Parliament has been far too passive in the way that, you know, and I guess frightened. And I understand the fear of, you know, this pandemic has been a terrifying experience for the country, for the world. And it's important not to transpose how we feel about it now that there are vaccines, there are therapeutics. Well, I mean, you know, look, over 500 people died yesterday from COVID, or were declared to have died from COVID yesterday. So this ain't going away, but it's different. But you know, those first few months, especially of that pandemic, really leading to the first year, were very frightening. And one of the features of public emergencies is that people tend to sort of bunker down and trust authorities.
Right. Okay. So trust authorities. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So I just want to shift gears a little bit. I can see we've had quite a few questions coming in on the YouTube chat. So I just want to pose some of them to you. So the first question we have here is, are there drawbacks to relying on courts to safeguard liberties to the extent they do? Does this raise democratic concerns?
Yeah, it's a great question. It depends what you think is a good setup for a democracy. I like the idea of a separation of powers, or a balance of powers, where there is scrutiny between different branches of the state, different parts of the state that can scrutinize each other. So I like the idea that, I mean, in the United States, there's famously the executive, the legislature, and the courts. I don't know whether we'd want in this country, and certainly we're not going to get the courts to be at the top of the tree, although lawyers will all tell you it's a great idea to have courts at the top of the tree. I think, you know, I practice in courts, you know, all the time in human rights law, and I think the courts can do a really good job of properly scrutinizing, especially particular decisions of public authorities. But I'll tell you something from a practical point of view. It's extremely difficult to use that system and to make it work. There's a million obstacles between your excellent human rights case and a victory in the courts. It really is, you know, an absolute climbing a mountain just to get what, you know, it's easy to think that if you read the newspapers, oh, government has lost in court, you know, oh, that's interesting. But to get there, it took a year of blood, sweat, and toil, lots of money, finding the right, you know, make sure you've got the right lawyers, the right team, the right claimants, all that kind of stuff, the right arguments. It's really difficult, but I suppose you want something so important like decisions on human rights law to be difficult. You want it not to be easy, and for the courts to take it seriously and to labour over it. And I think I think it works pretty well, actually, when you actually manage to get in front of a judge.
Yeah, once you pass all of these obstacles, eventually it should work. Okay, great. So the next question I have is, what happens when someone thinks their liberty is more important than safety for themselves or others? Where do we draw the line?
Yeah, I mean, really, really tough, as this pandemic has shown. And this is nothing new. 100 years ago, there was the Spanish flu. I don't think it's politically correct to call it the Spanish flu anymore, but it's 100 million people died worldwide from a similar-ish virus to the to COVID. 100 million people died because there was no vaccines, because we were in a different world. There wasn't sanitation in the same way. There weren't public hospitals in the same way. Mm-hmm. But just as every time a plague arrives, and during the Spanish flu, there were school closures, there were gathering bans, there were face covering mandates. In the United States, there were riots over the face covering mandates. People were shot over the face covering mandates. Yeah, in this exactly the same way that people have a strange sort of triggering reaction to being told to cover their face by the state or by a police person. Yeah. Even if that reaction is irrational, it's something, it's something deep inside people. Mm-hmm. But there are a pandemic, an infectious virus, highly infectious, dangerous virus, really does show how interconnected we are. Sometimes, we can be really interconnected, and one of the classic ways that we're interconnected is that we spread germs to each other when we interact. Right, yeah. And we've not lived through for a while a genuinely worldwide pandemic, one that spreads very quickly, that's almost impossible to stop. And just needs to be controlled as best you can. And we've not found any better ways to do it than mandating social distancing. I mean, look back, if you look back at 350 years to the 1650s odd plague in London, mm-hmm. They had laws they banned all social gatherings. So all pubs were closed. They banned feasting. They banned begging in exactly the same way as we did at the beginning of this pandemic. Except we were probably a bit kinder to homeless people, took them into hotels. They put in place curfews, which is a lockdown. The only reason that they didn't do a full lockdown is because it's only technology, modern technology, which has allowed 24/7 lockdowns to work, because people need to go out and work and feed themselves, and you can't do that in a society without the internet. You can't be locked down. I think that's why national lockdowns became a thing only because of COVID, only through COVID. But everything else, all of the social distancing laws have been around for hundreds of years. Quarantine is a concept in the Old Testament. The reason. So there's whole sections of the Old Testament about what you do when you've got somebody who has certain kinds of viruses, certain kinds of infections, like it was sort of what you do with lepers. You send them outside of the settlement, and they have to stay there until they've and it's all set out in some detail. They've got to have certain symptoms have got to stop them before they're let back in. This is thousands of years ago. That was written. You've got. I mean, the idea of quarantine comes from the Middle Ages. The reason it's called quarantine, by the way, is because it's 40 days. It was 40 days, as in Gaurang. Yeah. Why was it 40 days? Because 40 was seen as a sort of holy number because it keeps coming up in the Bible. So you have like Noah was out in the ark for 40 days, and Moses was at Mount Sinai for 40 days. So that's why it's quarantine. That's where the concept comes from. But it is, this stuff, we haven't figured out any better way of slowing the spread of a virus. And unfortunately, no state has managed to figure out a better way than mandating, at the beginning at least, social distancing. If there is a better way, then, I think everyone will be all ears. But, that's not to say that some of the measures will be looked on in the future as wrong.
Mhm.
You know, it might be found that national lockdowns didn't, you know, enforced lockdowns didn't actually help, and they hurt
Right.
on balance. It might be found that you know, that I don't know, that the schools shouldn't have been shut because it's too damaging to children's welfare and it didn't stop the spread of the virus. You know, who knows? But those are all. It's still essentially the same playbook as we've been using for thousands of years.
Okay, wonderful. So the next question I have here is, why is liberty important? What's the point of having it? I think you've touched on this very briefly at the beginning.
Yeah, it's because without liberty, we're prisoners. We're prisoners of whoever is preventing us being free.
Right.
You know, you can be imprisoned by your family. You can be imprisoned by a hospital. You can be imprisoned by the state. You can be imprisoned by circumstances. Maybe you just don't have, you can't afford to leave the house.
Mm-hmm.
The liberty is about going out and living the life that you want to live and that gives you pleasure and happiness and allows you to flourish as a person. And also, you know, taking a more sort of communitarian approach allows you to, you know, there's certain kinds of freedom to exist in a community. That humans are social animals. We want to, it's very important to us. Like, we're not islands. We are parts of communities, and everybody's community is important to them. And part of the challenge of a modern state is to allow people to be free, both as individuals and in their communities, while not impinging on other people's rights. And that's what the state kind of does. It negotiates between those rights. But I think we have a pretty good idea now. I you know, without being too sort of without being too arrogant about it, or you know, maybe we'll look back and we'll think this is all wrong. I think we have a pretty good idea of what a free and a good society looks like. The problem is implementing it.
Okay. So our next question is, do you think the UK's human rights will now be undermined due to Brexit and the government not having to follow the European Human Rights Convention, for example, work time directives?
It's possible, because, you know, one of the things that EU did was constrain the actions of states in taking away certain rights. You know, workers' rights were a really important part of the EU, of being in the EU, was things like anti-discrimination law, was things like the working time directive, was things like equal pay. You know, so it's always been the threat of Brexit for certain people and the opportunity of Brexit for other people, right, was that there was a risk that workers' rights could be taken away without without some sort of backstop, to coin a phrase, because EU law, you know, contrary to what I've told you throughout this talk, EU law did allow courts to strike down primary legislation because it was like a super piece of law.
Yeah,
it was a super law, but it's gone now. So so there's that backstop has gone as well.
Okay. So the next question I have is, what are the side effects of a safe society? Coddled populations are less able to evaluate risk, which comes with costs. Children kept indoors, fresh food binned, tricky debates untouched, etc.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. I mean, every parent knows there is a constant balance between protecting your children and giving them the freedom to learn for themselves how to protect themselves. When is the right time to let them walk to school on their own? What the risk of you doing it too late is they don't learn. You know, people have got to be allowed to make their own mistakes, just like children do. And I think that the way I'd look at it is this: that the more you have structures in the state that will, you know, fight each other, that will constrain each other, that will scrutinize each other, the more there is an opportunity for different arguments like that to be heard and to be resolved. And sometimes you've got to experiment. Sometimes you've got to try something out and see. Sometimes you will have the wrong balance, and you'll come down on the wrong side of it. I think if you believe in democracy and you believe in a healthy, functioning democracy, what the purpose of it is to sort of mediate between those different pressures, and the pressure to protect people versus the pressure to let people go free. And I think that's the best, again, going back to it's the best way we've found to do that. It's better than a totalitarian or an authoritarian state, in my mind, which decides for itself what's good for everybody. And it's better than an anarchic state where every individual decides for themselves what their kind of value system is and what they're going to and how they're going to treat other people, which I think is also not a good way to allow societies to flourish. So we've got to find some nice way in the middle, some nice middle way.
Okay. So just from that answer, then I've just thought of a question, which I just want to tack on to the end of that. So you said that the current situation is sort of the best of both worlds. We're not too authoritarian, but earlier, I think in 2020, VM, this platform, we hosted a conference called the Sustainable Narrative Conference, and it was during the time of COVID. And in it, there was a fireside conversation called Big State versus Little State, where we were evaluating between the two state structures. And in that, there was this notion of China, and because it is sort of authoritarian, when it came to the safety of its citizens, it could ensure its safety a lot more because it had the right to do so many more things, which in a country like the UK we just don't. So in some way, is it not okay to give up all authority to the government and say, here, we are in a state of emergency right now, please handle this for us and just make sure we are all safe?
Be careful what you wish for, I guess, is the answer. And I think we've learned some pretty good lessons from history. We should have done, right. which is when you get over a certain threshold of the amount of power given to a state, the state will abuse the power.
Okay.
China, yes, good systems for monitoring citizens, for surveillance of citizens. Police that have no particular bother about beating people up or shooting people. And 1 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. And these come hand in hand. They've always come hand in hand. Every authoritarian state has had gulags or concentration camps or something of that kind, because you can't allow everybody to do what they want, and there's always going to be enemies of the state. There will always be massive financial corruption. There will always be a million examples a day of the state overusing its power to sort of crush people. That's what these states do, and for all of their basic all of their problems, I think liberal democracies, at least generally, when power gets abused, that abuse of power will be exposed. Generally, obviously not always, but if in China the government, the president was having parties in the presidential palace during lockdown, do you think there would ever be a single whisper of that happening? Well, no, because the government controls social media and they control the newspapers, so it ain't going to happen. And maybe people, are going to, wouldn't be that bothered because, well, that's what they expect of their leaders. They sort of have a sort of cynicism. And I think, for all our flaws, I do think there is we are protected from certain abuses which you aren't protected from in other states. And I think also, look, I mean, I remember having this discussion back in early 2020. You know, back in February 2020, I did a podcast where I was discussing with a guy who'd just written a book about liberalism from the New Yorker, and we were sort of discussing, well, you know, obviously what's happening in China couldn't happen in the West, couldn't happen in Europe, because, you know, first of all, people wouldn't do it, wouldn't comply with lockdown, and second of all, we don't have the police force that would be able to impose such an authoritarian policy.
Yeah.
And to an extent we were right, and to an extent we were wrong. And you know, it was an absolute shock on the 23rd of March when it suddenly lockdown came. It was a huge shock to everybody's system, and nobody expected it, least of all the government, who didn't even know on the 23rd of March, 22nd of March, that's what they were going to do. So I think we've hopefully learned a lot about our societies from this period, and hopefully learned something about what to do if another pandemic hits. And I'm sure there'll be lots of analysis. You know, we've got a public inquiry starting about what we could have done differently, what we could have done better, what went well, what went badly. But you know, none of this is easy. None of it is straightforward. Anybody that says, look, I've got all the answers, I know exactly what society should look like, and this is all you need to do, I just think, I mean, good for them, but it's certainly, you know, it doesn't. I don't think life works like that with complex situations.
Okay, so I'm going to close the Q&A there, and sort of we're coming to the end of our conversation today. So just in closing, you spoke about liberty as this right to flourish. Now, here on VM, we like to look at things through a direct lens, and very loosely, it's a sustainable way of living, and through it, society will flourish, right? So my final question then to you is, if liberty gives you the right to flourish, what can we do if that right is taken away from us, or is slowly being taken away from us?
I mean, what do we do in this society?
Yeah, to make sure right.
What can we do in this society? Well, that is what democracy is about. It's about the people. You know, it's about the demos, and it's up to the people in the end. It's not up to Parliament to, you know, run society. It's up to the people. The Parliament are just our representatives. So we need to, you know, first of all, speak out using our right to protest, using our right to free speech, which, you know, people in China don't have that right, but we do. We speak out, we campaign, we use the courts, because we've got powers through the court. The people have powers through the courts, and ultimately we have the ballot box. You know, it's a bit of a blunt instrument, but it's there. And actually, as you can see at the moment with government, even if a government has an 80-seat majority, they can be threatened by public opinion, because public opinion doesn't wait for an election. Public opinion is like a wave; it can wash over a government, and they can be left, you know, completely strewn all over the beach. And I think that is what is happening now. Is that the people are powerful. We don't always know it, but we are. And I think this sort of current situation just goes to show it's the people who you know, in a democracy, the people are actually, it's the people who are at the top of the hierarchy. And I'm going to change what I said at the beginning.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today, Adam. It's been an enlightening conversation. I particularly like that ending remark. People have the power. So that was really great. Thank you so much.
It was a complete pleasure, and thanks so much for inviting me. And thanks to everybody who's listening.
Thank you. Okay, so in closing today, hopefully we're leaving you with some kindling to spark these conversations in your own homes. As always, we don't provide answers here. Maybe we just offer more questions to you. So if you enjoy this conversation and the work we do here at Vichar, please consider becoming a well-wisher. You can do so by scanning the QR code on the screen right now, or visiting us at www.vicharmanthan.org. Well-wishers help make the work we do here possible by providing small donations as they can. We also have other projects that are going on. So we have the VM podcast, which I know a little bit into the future. We have a podcast about liberty coming very soon. So please do engage with us there. Finally, we have our book clubs, which run up and down the country, from London all the way up to Manchester, with many more chapters coming soon. And again, to find all of this information, please visit www.vicharmanthan.org. And that's it for tonight. I hope you have a good evening, and namaste.